So, question of the day here. I haven't really posted anything like this. Most of my videos are more formal, but I'm thinking about just releasing videos that are more informal and have to do with questions that have just come along through my thoughts or through something I've been reading or what have you. There's one question in particular that has, graced the edges of the discourse that's been going on for a while about social justice and ethics, political correctness. Some know it in terms of postmodernism, if you're more familiar with the academy. But in either case, there's this idea that theology, Christianity, are the best responses to social justice. And that's what I want to talk about today and ask the question, is God necessary or a necessary response for social justice? I want to kind of cover two things here. One is why people ask that question or make that assumption or make that assertion rather. Why they make the assertion that God is the answer to social justice. And then why they think that. So I think, let me get my position, clear here. Just to begin, is that while I'm sympathetic to that notion, I don't agree with it wholeheartedly. And I'll explain why. But to go on, and answer the question, why has that been a response? Well, I think that's been a response because, I think in some ways it seems to be the most logical response, because what we're seeing with the rise of social justice, political correctness, postmodernism, is a sort of ethical failure. And with most societal ethical failures, especially those that reach at a societal level, we tend to invoke something like Christianity or religion to equalize that ethical failure. So I believe that's primarily why there is some rising voices that are coming and saying, oh, well, the answer is God, the answer is theology, the answer is a religion. And I don't necessarily disagree, but I don't think that is a necessary truth. And I'll explain why I don't believe that. The reason why I don't believe that is because when we're talking about belief in God, we're talking about a metaphysics. Now, some would say this metaphysics travels with a certain ethical belief, and that is true. There's ethics, the Bible or theology, Christianity, any of the Abrahamic traditions are not just metaphysics. They have metaphysics comprised or following ethics, right? And they're always kind of dancing with each other, let's say. But the thing is, while there's great value in the Christian ethos, which is why I'm sympathetic to this notion, and which is why I in part agree with it, while I'm sympathetic to it and agree with the Christian ethic and why we should try to employ that or have that ethic influence our societal behaviors, let's say, at least to some extent, at least as an imperfect ideal, right? While I hold that true, I don't think it necessarily needs to follow a grander metaphysical claim, which something like believing in God would be. And I say this in part because, well, one, it's just a way further push. We're talking about something that, again, I don't think isn't necessary, and doesn't really necessarily have to do with the latter part either, right? So I think you can have Christian ethics, and there's, I think, very many people that are in tune with this. I think even people on the apologetic side are in tune with it, and maybe even people on the atheistic side are in tune with this. With the notion that you can value Christian ethics without having a belief in God. And I'm not making an argument saying that you should necessarily. I think people should do what they're comfortable with. But do I think it's a little bit? I think it's a little bit of a generalization, actually. And this is why I kind of wanted to mention this, is because I think in some ways, while I in part agree with it, but I see that I question, well, why is this? Why are they saying this? I ask myself when I see there's a couple of people I follow and a couple of Christian non-profits, some apologetic non-profits that I follow, and I hear them saying all the time that, like essentially that God is the answer. And I think that's kind of, they're saying it in jest. And I think some of them believe it, and some of them are saying it in jest, and I think some of them are kind of rolling it down to a generalization. And I think it's important to actually articulate why God is the answer. And I believe that's because of the ethical followings that come along with something like Christian theology. It's not so much God, but it's the ethics that follow. And again, you don't have to necessarily have a belief in God for those ethics to follow. And the reason why, again, I think it's important pointing that out is because there's large swaths of people that are just not going to take the leap into believing in God, because in part they might actually sympathize with what I'm saying here, or relate to what I'm saying here, which is that it's not a necessity here. It's not really a necessity to make this argument or this claim, or to bring us out of the clutches of an incoherent ethic of which has been created by the cultures of political correctness, postmodernism, social justice, what have you. Okay, I think that's we're starting to see, and I think it's starting to become more of a pervasive idea that stuff is not working, that it's kind of toxic in some way, which is good that people are starting to get that kind of vibe, and they're starting to understand the nuances and why this is, it tends to be more regressive, counterproductive, and destructive rather than something that is progressive and advantageous for society to take and heed. But that doesn't mean, however, that I think we should just answer that with a generalized view of Christianity, or generalized view of theology, and just saying, oh, well, God is the answer. Well, it's not necessarily God, but it's the Christian ethic that I think would really help us solve this problem. And if you look even at the Western culture, or just America, let's just hold America. And if we look at America, it's actually, I would argue, much more influenced by the Christian ethos than Christian metaphysics, right? Because the thing about the Christian metaphysics is that in part it can kind of, because the Christian metaphysics also is different for different parts of the Abrahamic traditions, right? The theological metaphysics there. So I think that's one reason, because it's like not every group has the same metaphysics. Not even in every Christian denomination they have the same kind of metaphysical relation to God, let's say. So I think it's hard to try to keep that constant. And I believe even person to person, everyone has a different relationship with God. So to rely on this metaphysics to bring truth into the world, I think it'll start to be a slippery slope, because it'll inevitably be a little bit too inconsistent. But the coherence to the ethic is much more generalizable. It's much more accessible and easier to not only articulate, but I think for people to get a grasp and hold of, and say, if you say something like, the Christian ethic, I think people know what you're talking about, right? Because it's so ingrained in just the American way, let's say. Rather than if you say belief in God, that can mean so many things for so many people. So yeah, that's my position there, and that's what I feel like is being taken for granted when people say that thing. Now I have to reiterate that I appreciate when people do say that, because I get the sentiment and I agree with it to some extent, but I think they're generalizing a little bit and not giving us enough, and not being specific enough, because again, what we're seeing here is a failure in ethics, and we're saying, in part, what we're saying, I think, and I believe to be true, is that we're saying, hey, we had better ethics before, and I think that's essentially the point too that needs to be driven home here also, is that the Christian ethic worked better than this postmodern ethic. I understand that the postmodern ethic, the social justice ethic, is really trying to outdo the Christian ethic. You see, the postmodern, the social justice ethic is actually in competition with the Christian ethic, because it sees the Christian ethic as patriarchal and waspy, right? White, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon kind of thing. So the social justice ethic is in strict competition with the Christian ethic. But what people are starting to say is, I think that ethic worked a little bit better. And it's true. And I don't want to go into all of why. I think I will make another video, or actually write something about why that is, because it's a very important point, and it's something I don't see articulated a lot. I think the person that has articulated that the most has been Jordan Peterson. But outside of him, I don't think it's been articulated enough why the Christian ethic works better than the postmodern ethic, or why even the postmodern effort was flawed. If I were to say it in the simplest way, I would say that the problem with the postmodern ethic is that it almost seeks to encourage the worst of human behavior rather than mitigate the worst of human behavior, which is the opposite of what an ethic is supposed to do. This is the problem with postmodernism, and postmodernism wasn't really supposed to be used as an ethic necessarily. This is really just a social theory, right? But it's a social theory that transformed into an ethic and kind of a way of being that showed itself to be insufficient as such. And that is what caused a lot of the pushback. Because again, it's an ethic that doesn't mitigate the worst of our behaviors, but it almost justifies the worst of our behaviors. Because it says the world is a place in which people carry out power against each other. Different groups carry out power against each other. So if you believe in a sort of conception of life in which all you are is a member of a group that's competing with power against each other, that's the basis of your ethic, in which case you pretty much have none other than to fight for your group. But that is essentially a zero-sum game. You're always going to be ending up fighting So that's the basic problem with the postmodern ethic. It doesn't have a resolve. It's much less sophisticated. Um, and I talk to people, a lot of people on the left sometimes that I guess don't see that, and I always it irks me to think that okay, why don't you see that? It's not that leftism or liberalism is bad, and there's a distinction to make between leftists and liberals, but it's not that it's bad, but it's the fact that the the ethic that has developed in that regime or in that party or in that ideology, the left of center kind of ethic that has transpired, whether we're going to say it's a consequence of postmodernism or social justice or just general attitudes and leanings in the academic sphere, that kind of ethic that has transpired has shown itself to be not only just not very sophisticated, which it's not, because again, like I said, it wasn't really meant to be. That's the issue that's the issue with the postmodern ethic. It's like it wasn't really meant to be an ethic, and therefore it's insufficient to remain one. And that's part and parcel what the Christian ethic has over the postmodern ethic, is that the Christian ethic was actually developed to be one. It's just it's a tomb of ethics, essentially, or ethical examples. You can look at it. The Bible also teaches through, and I think this is all throughout even all the Abrahamic traditions, has, what I call negative ethics, or it has negative examples of it. So you will know not just what to do, but what not to do, right? So it also teaches in that way. So, but that's something that the Bible, Christianity, is pretty much dedicated to. So it's hard to beat. And I think the reason why people go back to it, and this is why I agree with the sentiment of God is the answer, Christianity is the answer. I agree with that because thus far, I don't think any group, any writer or group of writer, any discipline really, has come out with an ethic as sophisticated as the Christian ethic. It just hasn't happened. The closest thing we've had in some ways, I guess you could argue, is what's come out of humanism. But all of that is not very well articulated either. This is the hard part about answering this, is that, I don't think there's enough that's said about this, but the reason why I think people go back to the Bible and Christianity is, again, because it's a sophisticated body of ethics that's already kind of been worked out, and there's not only there's stories and parables about it. It has many different iterations, and it has a long legacy, which we don't have all that for the humanisms of the 20th century. We just don't have all that. It just hasn't been long enough, and there just hasn't been that much work done in the way of actually developing. Like, I don't think that's... So if we were to look at the Christian Bible and just look at it in the most simplistic form, and not to challenge anybody's beliefs, but if we were just to say that, it's pretty much held constant, that, there's some amount of people that wrote the Bible, there were some amount of flesh and blood persons that wrote the Bible, who saw that as their mission to do so, or whatever, at least at some point in time, were endowed with it, or chose to do it. They felt like they had to, or whatever the case may be, right? And they concentrated on doing that for the purpose of developing this tomb ethics and parable and what have you. But that isn't the case with something like humanism. Humanism is something that's come out of philosophic movements, and there's a discourse on it with the philosophers, but they all write kind of independently of each other because it's an academic thing, or it can go into the more general publishing field. But then it's just again writers writing back and forth, either for or against each other, or they're responding to certain tides, shifts and tides, and social phenomenon that take place, social and cultural phenomenon that take place. But no one's developing a new Western ethic. We're trying a new Western ethic. We're seeing maybe if something can develop, but no one's documenting it. At least as far as I've seen, no one's documenting it in the sense of something like an ethic that is as sophisticated or can compete with the sophistication of something like the Christian ethic. And I'd say one reason in particular, to go along with all the others I mentioned earlier, but another reason in particular is because unlike the Christian ethic, which maybe at some point in time, this wasn't always the case, but I think the humanist ethic, or the postmodern, the social justice ethic, the social justice ethic even more explicitly, degenerates into politics, political movements, ideological movements, and I think that's one of the ways it's been held as insufficient to be an actual ethic, not one that's very well sustaining. The problem with it, again, is that the new humanism, the postmodern ethic, the social justice ethic, degenerates into political ideology. And with that, you have divide. With that, you have divide and dissension and separation and bias inherently. You have inherent bias and all that goes along with that. So you can't have an ethic. You can't have a ethic. And again, we have to think, what do we want our ethics to be? Well, one of the primary things we want an ethic to be is what we call, and I know this is a long, awkward word, but what we say in philosophy, that it should be universalizable, meaning that it should be able to be made universal. But I think what we're seeing and what people are seeing now, and it's becoming more apparent to the general public, is that a lot of the precepts of the social justice, postmodern, ultra left-leaning kind of ideologies that are coming out aren't really able to be universalizable. They're not able to be universal. They're almost purely ideological, or they have degenerated into something almost purely ideological, and then oftentimes have really nothing to do with ethics or people, but it almost strictly to do with things like economic ideology and so forth. But you can't let your ethic degenerate into something other than what it's supposed to be. And I think that's another thing that the Christian ethic has been very good at. And it's, of course, not 100% on that side either, but I think it tries to see of itself as not straying too far from its purpose. But then again, one can argue as well that the purpose of the postmodern ethic was never to be an actual civic ethic, but was actually meant to be political, and that is is a position I would take as well, and I would say that is true. This, and that's the difference, is that, the Christian ethic is something that isn't political. It's something that's made personal, and it's something that was constructed in heat of giving human beings a way to deal with themselves. Now, the postmodern ethic was cropped up to give people a new conception of how they were supposed to deal with other groups, their groups against other groups. So there's a big difference. Anyway, I just thought I'd touch on that. I might do more videos like this. Maybe I'll put this somewhere where there can be some comments and what have you. But this is, of course, an ongoing question, and I think it's something worth thinking about as well. If you're watching this, and ask the question, is God the necessary answer to social justice, postmodernism, political correctness? We know that these things are showing signs of being ethical failures. But what is the answer to that ethical failure? Is God or the Christian ethic the exclusive answer? That's the question.